Hello. Um, I've basically reconsidered how I'm going to do this review series. Rather than focusing on reviewing it chapter by chapter, I'm going to focus on thematic features of Frantz Fanon Black Skin, White Mask. And I'm going to do it in relatively short videos, under 15 minutes. And I'm going to start with today's theme, which is focusing on the way in which Frantz Fanon's ideas have been ignored by a grand sweep of academia, particularly on the left, noticeably, of which he was a notable member of. So I'd like to start by reading the foreword by Homi Baba, pages 1 to 2. In the popular memory of English socialism, the mention of Frantz Fanon stirs a dim, deceiving echo. Black skin, white masks, the wretched of the earth, toward the African Revolution. These memorable titles reverberate in the self-righteous rhetoric of resistance whenever the English left gathers, in its narrow church or its Trotskyist camps, to deplore the immiseration of the colonized world. Repeatedly used as the idioms of simple moral outrage, Fanon's titles emptily echo a political spirit that is far from its own. They sound the troubled conscience of a socialist vision that extends, in the main, from ethnocentric Little Englandism to a large trade union internationalism. When that labourist line of vision is challenged by the autonomous struggles of the politics of race and gender, or threatened by problems of human psychology or cultural representation, it can only make an empty gesture of solidarity. Whenever questions of race and sexuality make their own organizational and theoretical demands on the primacy of class, state, and party, the language of traditional socialism is quick to describe those urgent other questions as symptoms of petty bourgeois deviation, signs of the bad faith of socialist intellectuals, the ritual respect accorded to the name of Fanon, the currency of his titles. The currency of his titles in the common language of liberation are part of the ceremony of a polite English refusal. There has been no substantial work on Fanon in the history of the New Left Review. One piece in the New Statesman, one essay in Marxism Today, one article in Socialist Register, one short book by an English author. Of late, the memory of Fanon has been kept alive in the activist tradition of race and class by A. Sivanandan's stirring indictments of state racism. Edward Said, himself a scholar engagé, has richly recalled the work of Fanon in his important T.S. Eliot Memorial Lectures, Culture and Imperialism. And finally, Stefan Feuchtwang's fine, far-reaching essay, Fanon's Politics of Culture, Economy and Society, examines Fanon's concepts of culture with innovatory insights for a non-deterministic political organization of the psyche. Apart from these exceptions, in Britain today, Fanon's ideas are effectively out of print. So, that's about the first 1.5 pages of the foreword by Homi Baba, and it's an interesting question of considering why it is that Fanon's works have been ignored, particularly by the left, considering how prominent and influential his views have been, his books have been, historically speaking. And it strikes me as amounting to a noticeable discomfort to fully acknowledge the responsibility for Europeans in general to accept responsibility for colonialism and for our participation in it historically. And it seems that quite often we are far more comfortable talking about things or topics that relate to our own experiences, our own working conditions, our own living standards here, in that we can conceive of it, materially speaking. But when it comes to similar questions of race and colonial history and legacy, well, that's outside of us. That's outside of our periphery. That's in another place. And so we don't I think, always consider it in the same way. And I think that extends to how the left have ignored Frantz Fanon to this day. This was written in 1986. I don't know. The foreword was written in 1986, I think. But the tendency to ignore these questions, whilst maybe has improved a bit, it's still very prominent. And it's interesting that Fanon was writing fundamentally from a Marxist perspective, but in a lot of ways was compensating for a failure on the part of Marx himself and people in similar circles to him at the time who were living during the age of colonialism and slavery, but barely made any reference to colonialism or slavery. They made reference to the material conditions in England or Scotland or America or Europe, rather than the structures of slavery and colonialism, whereby modern capitalism was based upon at the time they were writing in the mid-19th century. So there's been a long history, I think, within the left of ignoring these wider questions of race as a mainstream, and that extends to ignoring people on the left who do talk about these questions. As it said in the book, very little reference to Fanon's works have been made. Again, that's probably something that has changed since, but he died in the early 60s, and this is actually written on the 25th anniversary of his death. So 25 years have gone by where he'd basically been entirely ignored by his own comrades, so to speak. And even to this day, he's still not someone who's a household name like Noam Chomsky, for example. But he's incredibly influential. But again, because of what he talked about and the perspective in which he talked about it, he was ignored. Because I don't think people in Europe, regardless of the left wing or right wing, whatever, it doesn't matter, they did not know how it was relevant to them and their lives. They didn't know how to understand questions of colonialism, questions of racism, and also the history of relationship between colonialism, racism, and race itself to the wider capitalist system. They simply didn't know, and that's probably something which, hopefully to a lesser extent, but has continued to this day. And it's an important question to grapple with because it fundamentally gets to the core of what it is to be a Marxist, to be on the left, and to be a critic of capitalism. If we are unable to even grapple with the foundations of the system and only base it around something that we have a periphery for, that we have a basis for understanding it, how are we going to actually fully understand the system itself? When we ignore fundamental aspects of it because we don't know how to conceive of it. So that's a main thought that I had about that section. And I think also that when we look at the relationship, especially in this last bit of the first page, I'll read it again. The language of traditional socialism is quick to describe those urgent other questions as symptoms of petty bourgeois deviation. So again, it's dismissal. It's not just ignorance, it's outright dismissal of anything which is outside of what you can conceive of as being something which is fundamentally counter to you and counter to what you want to do and part of the problem of society. That's rather than accepting these questions of race and colonialism as being ultimately part and parcel with any kind of genuine critique of capitalism and understanding the history of capitalism. It's an outright dismissal that has in many ways continued to this day, because it's more comfortable to talk about questions of present perceivable material conditions rather than material conditions happening somewhere else, or even happening here, but less at the forefront of thought. And yeah, that was basically what I thought of it, that topic initially, and why Frantz Fanon has been so ignored by the left, and why he's such an interesting person to study. Because he takes Marxism, which in its early days did frankly ignore these wider questions of colonialism and race, and he applies Marxism in a way that reflects that history. Let's try it. No, I won't read that. And so it's interesting that Frantz Fanon doesn't seem to fit squarely within one ideological framework, because he has to be able to be unorthodox in a sense that he is taking an idea like Marxism, a critique like Marxism, to critique a wider system, and adjusting it for critiquing understanding a colonial mentality. But at the same time, he has to do that in a way which fundamentally takes Marxism in a perspective that it wasn't initially designed to. A critique of Marxist critique initially ignored these questions. So he had to, in many ways, add on things, add on ways of analysing society, and that way change the way in which Marxist critique can be understood. So I think he's a very interesting person to look at, particularly if we're looking to understand liberationist thought within Marxist critique, because he was one of the people at the forefront of it. There's Marx and there's Marxism. Marxism is something which goes way beyond anything written by Karl Marx. So yeah, that was my initial thought. I found it very interesting. I suggest you all buy the book if you haven't got it already. Give it a read, it's very interesting. Comment below what you thought about that. Why has Frantz Fanon been ignored so much? Do you disagree with anything I've said? Agree with it? Yeah, thank you very much.